Hi, and welcome back for this third of three in a small series about the athletic culture and day of the Apostle Paul. This is part of the AGON Institute of Sports Ministries, Theology of Competition and Sport, and we're trying to give you, the sports minister, the foundation from which you can understand and interpret the biblical passages that the Holy Spirit inspired the Apostle Paul to write. We talked the last two times about the 4 crown games, Isthmian Games at Delphi, the Olympic Games at Olympia, and the Nemean Games at Nemea. Now we're going to where I really think we can get the most significant correspondence for getting the Pauline writings connected with the games of that day. On your 19th slide in this series, we've been going through them in this 3-part series, you'll see 3 pictures. And you'll see some of the highlights of the scriptures I'm poured out. Run that you may obtain. Don't run aimlessly. These were all, I believe, inspired by what Paul would have seen and observed at Isthmia. You see, he would have passed right past the Isthmian game site on his way as he walked from Athens to Corinth. In fact, you can still drive right past it today on a superhighway. Again, I believe that he would have gone from Cenchreae on his way to Cenchreae to Jerusalem. He was leaving Corinth. He went to the port of Cenchreae, and he then sailed to Jerusalem. It's also the most likely background for the passages in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, and 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24, and the next few. And this site that you're seeing these pictures of were uncovered, excavated by Oscar Bronier, who spent a lifetime in archaeological digs and detailing this site. Unfortunately for us today, while he did a great job of uncovering the temple, the theater, the bathhouses, he didn't get much of the athletic sites. And you can see that in these pictures on the right. We see the starting blocks for the runners, but we don't have the whole stadium. In fact, there are modern homes that are sitting on the top of those athletic sites. There's still much work to do, and hopefully maybe someday a student of one of these courses that I've taught will say, I'm going to go finish that work that Bronier started. Now what you see here in your 20th, and you can kind of toggle back and forth or look back and forth between the 19th and 20th slides, was a clever system of getting runners to start together and not get ahead at an advantage of one another. It's called the Husplex, the Husplex. And you can see that little, what looks maybe like the top of a building on top of that slide, and there's a little hole in the middle. That's where, if you look back in the slides on 19, where I was standing. I was standing down in that hole, and I was holding the strings, and every one of those lines going out are strings that would then drop those wooden bars all at the same time. It was an amazing development of that era. And so you can see that this was something that was very clever, and it was part there of the Isthmian Games. Now, right where we were at the stadium, now look down over the little bit of a valley. In the foreground, you see the remnants, the remains of the temple of Poseidon. Poseidon was the god of the sea. Neptune he's also known by. But Poseidon, why here? Because only 5 miles separates the Gulf of Corinth and the Corinthian Sea there, and you can see that Poseidon would be the logical god, like Zeus was of Olympia and the Pythian gods of Delphi, etc. But you get a sense then all the way down the valley, you can see a bunch of rubble down there, and that was where the the bathhouses was. That's where the athletic village, if you're used to the Olympic way of going. Now, the Isthmian Games, again, in the honor of Poseidon. And again, you can see where all these temples on this map, and they had stadiums. Now, the upper right-hand corner, you see how those temples were built. Beautiful, beautiful. Isthmia had a small theater, a beautiful temple to Poseidon, and it was located just outside of Corinth. I'm going to show you now some of that bathhouse and what Oscar Bonnier uncovered. This mosaic floor down in Olympic Village was just simply beautiful. This is still intact, thousands and thousands of years. When he uncovered this, you can imagine his joy. It's all of a nautical theme. You can see that. You can see that this wall of shame for them was reminding them how fleeting this octopus can fly by. And it was almost totally intact there. Okay, this would have been the basement of a sauna, slide 25. Every one of those pillars would have built up to where you can see where the floor would have been to hold a floor. And they ran, you can see on the far end of this slide, you can see where the hot spring waters would come in, hot, hot, hot waters, and then the steam would rise up through vents. And this is where the athletes would go, either before or after their events. This is an amazing technology for this time and era. So, those 4 crown games, and you see why Isthmia would have been where Paul would have gotten his foundations for all of his writings. But I want you to show you again now back to Alexander and his land that he had conquered. You can see that there's a lot of places on this map that had stadiums, had gymnasium. Over 200 Greek cities that had versions of this. So it's not just the big 4 and none else. It's not just us 4, no more block the door, but these are all 200, all over. Alexander spread this culture. This was the culture of Paul. Now I want to give you a couple other ones that were in New Testament. Here's what was in Ephesus. This would have been outside the stadium, and these were statues for bases of athletes, and they would have gone through that big mound, which was the archway to go into the stadium. Ephesus, huge, huge athletics. A smaller city and a stadium in Turkey. Again, a little bit of creature comforts there, you can see. And you can see that this was all over. And this, which you've seen before in this course, was the Colosseum, the underground of the gladiators and the animals, and then there would have been a floor there. And the Circus Maximus comes up as well. And you see that these were these massively huge stadiums. The Colosseum would have sat somewhere around 60,000, 45 to 60,000. Circus Maximus, some estimates were up to almost 400,000. This is the era in which Paul lived, ministered, and wrote. And this is where he got his theology of sport, where he got his theology of the human body, and so much more. I hope that these visuals give you, as the sports minister, an innate foundation for your interpretation of those biblical words, those biblical passages, those biblical concepts that Paul was inspired to write. You have to be the interpreter of those to your culture today. But without this foundation, you'll find it much harder. Again, I'm Dr. Greg Linville. This is the third and end of our series on Paul being involved in his culture in the first century for the AGON Institute of Sports Ministry. Thanks for joining us.